Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Nurses, hospital workers of Reddit. What is the most paranormal, weirdest thing you have ever experienced while working? Story 1. Whistling in the hospital basement.
For a couple of years, I worked at a hospital doing patient transport. The transport home base was located in the basement, a space shared with the laundry facilities and supply sorting areas. It was not the most pleasant environment, especially late at night. After one eerie encounter, I dreaded every late shift. One quiet night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling near the elevator at the end of the hallway. Thinking it was my coworker, I leaned around the corner expecting to see him, but no one was there. Shrugging it off, I dismissed it as my imagination. To pass the time, I grabbed some snacks and relaxed in the break room. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. I stepped out and saw a hospital bed rolling down the corridor, bumping against the walls. Convinced my coworker was playing a prank, I radioed him. His response chilled me. He was upstairs in the cafeteria. Still skeptical, I decided to catch him in the act. As I passed the laundry room, the machine started running, even though no one was there. I peeked inside, expecting to find him hiding, but the room was completely empty. The moment I stepped inside, the machine stopped abruptly. My unease grew. I hurried out, making my way toward the elevator. Then, I heard the whistling again. This time, it was unmistakably close. My pulse quickened as I turned to see boxes falling off shelves at the far end of the hallway. Gloves, tissues, and packages of medical supplies tumbled one by one, as though an unseen force was purposefully knocking them off. A cold chill ran through me. Goosebumps covered my skin, and an overwhelming sense of being watched made the hair on my neck stand up. Fighting the rising panic, I reached the elevator and pressed the button frantically. As the doors opened, I felt something lightly brush my arm. I rushed upstairs and found my coworker sitting in the cafeteria, confirming he had not left. Shaken, I shared what had happened. That night marked the beginning of the end for me. In that role, I transferred soon afterward, leaving behind the unsettling memory of the spirit that seemed to mimic my habit of whistling.
Story 2. Man with red eyes.
I used to work at a skilled nursing facility, often assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. One night while I was in the linen room restocking my cart, I felt someone shuffle up behind me. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Startled, I turned around, but the room was completely empty. The door was still shut, and there was no one else inside. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. Around the same time, one of the residents, an elderly woman, began complaining that a man was coming into her room at night. Given her Alzheimer's diagnosis, I did not think much of it, assuming it was a symptom of her condition. To reassure her, I promised to check on her throughout the night. She continued to complain about this man every night for the next 2 weeks. Her descriptions became more unsettling with time, so I eventually asked her to tell me exactly what he looked like. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she said, "He is very dark, tall, with red eyes. He wears a white cloth. Oh, he is standing right behind you now, honey." A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced as I turned around, but no one was there. The room felt heavy, the kind of silence that presses into your ears. I forced a smile, trying to calm her, but I was deeply unnerved. The next night she passed away peacefully in her sleep. To this day, I cannot explain what happened. Was it a hallucination brought on by her illness, or was there truly someone there that only she could see? That moment and her haunting words will stay with me forever.
Story 3. Do not open the freezer.
Working in the hospital morgue was always unsettling, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced there. Late one night, while I was organizing paperwork in the corner of the room, I heard it for the first time, a faint knocking. It came from inside the freezer where the bodies were stored. I froze, listening intently as the rhythmic tapping echoed softly in the quiet room. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe the pipes were settling, or the compressor was making noise, but it sounded deliberate. The next night, it happened again, louder this time. A slow, steady knock that seemed to resonate with an unnatural weight. It was as though someone, or something, was trapped on the other side. I mentioned it casually to the pathologist the following day, expecting him to laugh it off or explain it scientifically. Instead, his reaction chilled me to the bone. He stopped what he was doing, looked up, and fixed me with a piercing stare. His hands gripped my shoulders tightly as he spoke. You hear that? You never open that door when they are knocking. Never. His tone was dead serious, his eyes wide with something I could only describe as fear. I tried to press him for an explanation, but he shook his head and walked away, leaving me alone with my growing unease. The knocks continued every few nights, sometimes soft and hesitant, other times loud and insistent. I never dared approach the freezer, the pathologist's warning echoing in my mind. But the feeling in the room during those moments was indescribable, thick, oppressive, and cold, even by morgue standards. To this day, I do not know what would have happened if I had opened that freezer door. I never asked the pathologist again, and he never brought it up, but the sound still lingers in my memory, and I sometimes wonder, was it just my imagination, or was something in there really trying to get out?
Story 4. Ghost named Bill.
When I was a student nurse, I cared for an elderly woman with end-stage renal failure. She had a do not attempt resuscitation order in place and was nearing the end. Despite her condition, she was surprisingly lucid, and we often had small chats to pass the time. One quiet afternoon, we were talking when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes widened, and she looked over my shoulder. Bill's here. I have to go, she said softly. Before I could respond, she took her final breath. Later, as I sifted through her old medical notes, I stumbled upon an eerie mention of Bill. According to her records, Bill was a ghost she claimed to have seen since childhood. She described him as a tall man with a pale, elongated face and unnaturally long nails. He terrified her as a child, though no one ever believed her stories. In her notes there was one particular account that made my skin crawl. She had been just 8 years old, sitting on the floor of her room playing with her doll when she first saw Bill. She wrote that he emerged from the shadows in the corner, his head tilting unnaturally to one side as if his neck was broken. His long nails dragged along the wooden floor, producing a sound that froze her in place. He stared at her with hollow, sunken eyes, his face devoid of emotion. When she screamed for her parents, he lifted a bony finger to his lips, gesturing for silence. By the time her parents burst into the room, Bill had vanished, leaving only faint scratch marks on the floor as evidence of his presence. Years later, as a teenager, she claimed Bill returned. One night, while she was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she saw him standing behind her in the reflection. His hand reached out as if to touch her shoulder, but when she spun around, no one was there. The next morning, deep scratches marred her shoulder, though she had no memory of how they got there. As I read her words, a chill ran down my spine. The fact that she saw Bill again moments before her death left me wondering, was he a figment of her imagination, or had he been waiting for her all along?
Story 5. Children in the Shadow.
About 2 years ago, I worked on an acute care floor during a fungal meningitis outbreak. The unit, which housed 20 patients, was overwhelmed with 10 to 15 meningitis cases at any given time. The patients ranged in age from their 20s to their 90s. Each was kept in strict isolation, their rooms sealed off with no contact between them. Yet, despite their separation, many reported the same terrifying hallucinations: shadowy children crouching in the corners of their rooms, and the faint, haunting strains of religious hymns echoing from nowhere. One evening, a middle-aged woman in her 40s, whom I will call Mrs. Coldwell, had an episode that still sends shivers down my spine. As I entered her room to check her vitals, she was trembling, her wide eyes fixated on the far corner. "Do you see them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I glanced at the corner, but of course it was empty. I asked her what she meant, and she shakily pointed, describing two children, a boy and a girl, both with hollow black eyes, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. She said they were staring at her, whispering words she could not understand. Suddenly, Mrs. Coldwell began humming a hymn. It was faint at first, but as I listened, the melody sent a chill through me. It was a song I had never heard before, eerie and sorrowful. She stopped humming abruptly and turned to me, her face pale. "Do you hear it?" she asked. Before I could respond, the room seemed to grow colder. The monitors began to beep erratically, and her breathing quickened. She screamed, pointing at the corner again, tears streaming down her face. "They are coming closer," she cried out. I called for help, and as other staff rushed in, Mrs. Coldwell fainted. When she regained consciousness, she had no memory of what had happened, but her words lingered with me. What disturbed me most was that hers was not an isolated case. Many patients described the same children and the same haunting music. To this day, I cannot explain how they all shared the same chilling visions.
Story 6. Resurrection Room.
During my time as a student, I was called to assist with a stroke patient who had coded. The medical team was performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, with unwavering determination, working tirelessly for 45 minutes. But despite their efforts, the patient did not survive. The scene was somber as we cleaned her up, preparing for her family to say their goodbyes. She had been declared brain dead, with no pulse for nearly an hour. Her skin had turned ashen grey, and a faint sickly odor began to permeate the room, a stark reminder of the inevitable. Her family arrived, their grief palpable as they whispered final words to the lifeless body before departing. The room fell silent, but as the last family member left, something impossible happened. She sat up. The motion was sudden and unnatural, her lifeless body springing upright as if yanked by an unseen force. Her grey lips parted, and she called out, her voice dry and hollow, "Where is my family?" Every nurse in the room froze, their eyes wide with terror. The air grew thick with dread as they rushed to her side, fumbling to reconnect monitors and bring equipment back into play. A chilling realization gripped us. This woman, dead for nearly an hour, was speaking and moving. The monitors were reattached, and against all logic, her vitals stabilized. She clutched the hand of the nearest nurse, her grip unnervingly cold, and whispered, "I needed to see them. I needed to say goodbye." Her family was summoned again, and she spoke with them one last time. Her words were soft and deliberate, but none of us could ignore the way her eyes seemed to darken as she spoke, as if shadows danced beneath her lids. Then, just as suddenly as she had returned, she collapsed. This time she was truly gone. The monitors flatlined, and the ashen color returned to her skin. The room was silent once more, but no one could shake the feeling that we had witnessed something far beyond the natural order. What had brought her back? And why had she needed to say goodbye twice?
Story 7. The Silent Watchers.
As a night nurse for the past 4 years in an old folks' home, I have grown used to unsettling moments, but one particular experience still haunts me. There was a palliative care resident, Mrs. Holloway, who often struggled to sleep because of vivid hallucinations. Night after night, she would describe figures in her room, silent, motionless people with hollow eyes and dark expressions. "They just stand there, watching, waiting for me to die," she whispered one evening, her frail voice trembling with fear. At first, I dismissed it as a symptom of her condition. Hallucinations are not uncommon in patients near the end of life. Still, there was something about her description that chilled me. She called them the voodoo people and described their twisted faces dressed in tattered robes blending into the shadows. One night, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself resisted every breath. I made my rounds and paused by the room of Mrs. Conway, the elderly woman across the hall. Mrs. Conway rarely spoke, often staring blankly at the walls. That night, as I opened her door to check on her, she turned her head slowly toward me, her pale eyes wide with terror. "They're in here too," she whispered, her voice hoarse but certain. "They have come for her, but now they are watching me." A shiver ran down my spine. Mrs. Conway had no way of knowing what Mrs. Holloway had described, yet her words were eerily identical. I stood frozen in the doorway, scanning the dimly lit room. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a faint silhouette near the corner, a shadow where no shadow should have been. My heart pounded as I quickly backed out of the room, feeling eyes on me the entire time. Later that night, Mrs. Holloway passed away. The silence that followed was suffocating, but I will never forget the fear etched on both women's faces or the unshakable feeling that something unseen had been waiting for her.
Story 8. Echoes of the Call Bell.
I used to work in a personal care home where strange occurrences were not uncommon, but one incident tied to a resident who passed away traumatically has stayed with me. Call bells going off in unoccupied rooms were nothing new. It seemed to happen often, usually a day or two after a resident had passed. The bells would chime loudly, summoning us to rooms that were completely empty. No staff, no residents, just the eerie silence of an unoccupied space. One particular night, shortly after a resident, Mr. Elwood, had passed, things escalated. His death had been traumatic. Nurses had performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation in a desperate attempt to save him, but it was in vain. That night, the midnight staff claimed to have seen him. They described him exactly as he had been in life, a tall man with a slow, deliberate gait. He was seen walking down the hallway, as he often did during his restless evenings. The sighting was brief, but unsettling. The staff initially thought their minds were playing tricks on them. Moments later, the alarm on the secured unit's door blared loudly, breaking the stillness of the night. The door was one that Mr. Elwood had frequently tried to use during his time in the care home. He always wanted to leave, often forgetting where he was or why he was there. Yet when the alarm went off that night, the security footage showed no one near the door. The staff searched the area thoroughly but found nothing. The hallway was empty, and the door remained securely locked. Still, the alarm had been triggered. The silence that followed was deafening, and the feeling of unease lingered in the air. The following morning, whispers spread among the staff. Some believed it was a glitch in the system, while others were certain they had witnessed Mr. Elwood making one final attempt to leave.
Story 9. Phantom Feline.
I work in a cardiovascular surgical intensive care unit, a place where life and death often hang in a delicate balance. Patients come and go, some with their bodies broken, others with their minds clouded, but one particular stretch of nights left an indelible mark on all of us. The first report came from a patient in one of the corner rooms. They claimed to see a cat walking around their room. At first we dismissed it as a hallucination, not uncommon for patients in critical care. However, by the end of the shift, a patient in another corner room told us the same thing. This was no ordinary cat, they said. It was a menacing creature, its dark fur bristling, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It would slink around the corners of the room, hissing and baring its teeth, as if guarding something unseen. By the third night, all 4 corner rooms reported identical sightings. The descriptions were chillingly consistent, a malevolent cat that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The reports were so similar that the entire night staff became uneasy. We searched the unit thoroughly, leaving no room unchecked. Security and operations staff were called in to assist, but there was no sign of the animal. The cameras showed nothing, yet the patients' accounts continued. The next day, the tension reached its peak. 2 of the patients in the corner rooms unexpectedly coded. Despite our best efforts, they could not be saved. The sense of dread that swept through the unit was palpable. The remaining 2 patients in the corner rooms refused to sleep that night, terrified that the cat would return. One claimed to hear it growling from the shadows, while another swore they felt its icy presence near their bed. The sightings stopped after that, but the eerie events left a scar on our team. Even now, whenever a patient in one of the corner rooms mentions seeing a cat, an unspoken fear grips us all.
Story 10. Ghost in the Gown.
As a psychiatric registered nurse, I worked in an acute care adult unit, but was occasionally assigned to cover the children's unit. One evening shift, after 10 p.m., all the young patients were in their rooms, seemingly asleep. The silence of the night was abruptly shattered by a child's terrified screams. I rushed to the room to find a 7-year-old boy sobbing uncontrollably. He was shaking, his face pale and covered in sweat. A psychiatric technician was trying to calm him, but his fear was palpable. Between gasping breaths, the boy explained that he had seen something, a man. After he began to calm down, he described the figure, a white man with grey hair wearing a hospital gown. The man had been standing in his room. As we reassured him, the boy suddenly froze mid-sentence, his wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on something behind me. He whispered in a trembling voice, "Miss, please be still." "Oh no, he's right behind you." A chill ran down my spine. Fighting the urge to turn, I spoke firmly into the air, addressing the unseen figure. We told him the boy was frightened and asked him to leave. To my astonishment, the boy said the man had turned around and walked away. The room grew quiet, and we began to think the worst was over. But not even 3 minutes later, a scream erupted from the other end of the hall. I sprinted to the room of a 17-year-old patient, only to find him standing on his bed, his face a mask of terror. "He's here," the boy cried, pointing at the corner of the room. The white man in the hospital gown. The description was identical. 2 patients, different ages, had described the same figure within minutes of each other. That night left me questioning what lingers in the shadows of the psychiatric ward.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.